Get out. We're done. Sign the papers or I'll have my lawyers make your life hell." Ethan Walker threw the divorce folder across the dinner table on their 12th wedding anniversary, knocking over the candles Sophia had lit, scattering her carefully arranged flowers across the floor. He didn't even flinch. He was already calling Victoria. Sophia looked down at the mess, looked at her husband's back as he walked away laughing into his phone. She picked up the pen, signed every page, said nothing. What Ethan never knew what would destroy him completely was that he had just declared war on the wrong family. If you've ever watched someone throw away something priceless without even realizing what they had, this story is for you. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Ethan Walker had the kind of confidence that filled a room before he even walked into it. Tall, broad-shouldered, always dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He moved through New York City like a man who believed the city had been built specifically for him. And honestly, looking at his life from the outside, you couldn't entirely blame him for thinking that. At 42 years old, Ethan was the CEO of Walker Development, one of the most talked-about real estate firms on the East Coast. He had his name on buildings. He had his face in business magazines. He had a penthouse apartment in Midtown, a weekend house in the Hamptons, and a garage full of cars that most men only ever see in dealership windows. His LinkedIn profile had 500,000 followers. His assistant scheduled his weeks down to 15-minute increments. To the outside world, Ethan Walker was the definition of a self-made man. That was the story he told himself every single morning. And he had told it so many times for so long that he had completely forgotten it was a story. The truth, the real truth, was something entirely different. But we'll get to that. What matters right now is the night of September 14th, a Friday evening, the kind of autumn night in New York where the air has just enough bite to remind you that summer is finished, that something is changing, that the season is turning. Ethan came home late, later than usual, even for him. He had spent the afternoon at the Walker Development offices on the 43rd floor of a glass tower in Midtown, celebrating the signing of the Horizon Tower contract, a $280 million mixed-use development deal that was without question the biggest project of his career. His team had uncorked champagne at 3 in the afternoon. By 6, Ethan had already moved the celebration to a private dinner with Victoria Blake. Victoria was 29 years old, his personal secretary, and she had a way of looking at Ethan like he was the most important man on the planet, which in her world he probably was. He arrived home at 8:30, carrying a leather folder under his arm. Sophia had made dinner. She always made dinner on their anniversary, even after 12 years, even when he was late, even when he didn't call. There were candles on the table. There was music playing softly from somewhere in the apartment. She had put on the simple blue dress that he had once told her he loved back in the early years, when he still noticed things like that. She looked up from the kitchen and gave him a careful smile, the kind of smile that had learned to be careful over time. "Happy anniversary," she said. Ethan set the leather folder down on the table next to her carefully arranged centerpiece. He straightened his cuffs. He didn't sit down. He didn't take off his jacket. "We need to talk," he said. Something shifted in Sophia's expression. Not panic, not even surprise, just a very quiet recognition, the way you recognize weather coming in before the clouds have fully gathered. "Okay," she said softly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Ethan said, and his voice had that particular quality of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say enough times that it no longer sounds like he's saying it to a human being. "About where I am, about where I'm going, about what I need." Sophia set down the spoon in her hand very slowly. She turned to face him fully. "And I've come to realize," he continued, "that I need something different, someone different, someone who understands the level I'm operating at now." "Ethan?" "I filed the papers," he said. He opened the leather folder. "I just need your signature." The room went silent in a way that was almost physical. Sophia looked at the papers on the table. She looked at the candles she had lit. She looked at her husband, this man she had stood beside for 12 years, through the early years of barely making rent, through his first failed project, through the lawsuits and the sleepless nights, and the moments when he had sat on the edge of their bed with his head in his hands, saying he didn't know if he could keep going. She had been there for all of it, every single piece of it. And now he was standing in their dining room on their anniversary, handing her divorce papers without having removed his jacket. "Who is she?" Sophia asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a question, quiet and direct. Ethan didn't flinch. "That's not what this is about." "Her name Ethan." A beat of silence. Then Victoria. Sophia nodded once. Something in her face changed in that moment, not shattered, not crumpled, but settled, like something that had been uncertain, finally becoming certain. "I see," she said. "I know this isn't easy," Ethan said, and he was already reaching into his jacket pocket for his phone, glancing at a notification. "But I think you know deep down that this hasn't been working for a long time. You're a talented woman, Sophia. You'll be fine. You'll more than be fine." "How generous of you," she said. He missed the edge in her voice entirely. He was already looking at his screen. "My lawyers have been very fair," he added. "The settlement is more than reasonable. The apartment on the Upper East Side, your car, a very comfortable support arrangement." "I don't want your money, Ethan." He looked up. For a brief moment, something crossed his face. Not guilt, not quite, but a flicker of something that might have been discomfort. "Sophia." "I'll sign your papers," she said. Her voice was steady as still water. "Give me a pen." He hadn't expected that. He had prepared himself for tears, for argument, for the kind of scene he had already mentally categorized as an inevitable but manageable obstacle. He had not prepared himself for a woman who looked at him and at his papers and simply reached out her hand and said, "Give me a pen." He handed her one. She signed. She signed every page with the same calm, deliberate hand that she used when she was drawing building plans. No hesitation, no drama. She closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "Dinner's on the stove," she said, "in case you're hungry." Then she walked to the bedroom, closed the door quietly behind her, and sat down on the edge of the bed in the blue dress she had put on for their anniversary. And for a long time she didn't move. She just sat there in the quiet breathing. And then she picked up her phone and she called her father. It rang twice. "Sophia." Richard Morgan's voice was exactly as it always was, calm, warm, and carrying within it the particular weight of a man who had seen nearly everything and still chose to be gentle. "Dad," she said. Just that word. Just that single word. And Richard Morgan, who had built one of the most powerful investment conglomerates in American history, who had negotiated deals that made headlines on 4 continents, who had faced down senators and market crashes and corporate wars that would have destroyed lesser men, Richard Morgan went very quiet. "Tell me," he said. And she did. She told him everything. She told him about the papers on the table, about the candles she had lit, about the blue dress. She told him about Victoria. She told him about the 12 years, about the early days, about all the invisible hours she had given to a man who had apparently been keeping a running tally of everything she was not. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then he asked very gently, "Are you done with him?" "Truly done." Sophia thought about it, which might seem strange. You might think the answer would be instant. But Sophia was the kind of woman who didn't say things she didn't mean. She thought about the man she had married, the man she had believed in, the man she had stayed up with at 3 in the morning when the world seemed to be collapsing around them. And she thought about the man who had handed her a folder without taking off his jacket. "Yes," she said, "I'm done." "All right," Richard said. 2 words. That was all. But in those 2 words was a decision, and in that decision was everything that was coming. Now here is where the story takes its first true turn, because if you think this is a story about a heartbroken woman, you have fundamentally misunderstood who Sophia Morgan was. Sophia had spent 12 years quietly stepping back, not because she was weak, not because she didn't see what was happening, but because she was the kind of person who chose love over leverage, who believed that a marriage was something you sustained through patience and good faith. She had watched Ethan grow, had watched his confidence tip into arrogance, had told herself that the man she married was still in there somewhere. She had been wrong, but being wrong about love does not make you foolish. It makes you human. And now for the first time in 12 years, Sophia Morgan was not stepping back. She was stepping out. The morning after the signing, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to her own attorney, not Ethan's attorney. Her attorney, a woman named Grace Park, who had worked in financial and family law for 20 years, and who had the kind of precise, unhurried intelligence that made opposing counsel visibly nervous. The second call was to Daniel Brooks. Daniel had been the CFO at Walker Development for 6 years. He was a careful man, a principled man, and he had watched Ethan's behavior deteriorate with growing unease for the last 2 of those 6 years. He and Sophia had always gotten along. She had a way of seeing the people Ethan tended to treat as furniture, and Daniel had never forgotten that she had once covered for him with Ethan during the week his mother was dying. He had never been able to repay that. "Sophia," he said when he picked up, "I heard. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." A pause. "Okay. How much of Walker Development is actually what Ethan thinks it is?" A longer pause this time. "That," Daniel said slowly, "is a very complicated question." "Make it simple for me." Daniel was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. She could almost hear him deciding something. "The Horizon Tower deal," he said finally. "The one they just signed." "Yes." "Ethan thinks the financing came together because of his negotiation, because of his reputation. And the lead lender pulled back 3 weeks ago," Daniel said. "They were going to walk. The deal was dead, Sophia. I watched it happen. And then overnight the financing was back. Different structure, same result, and I could not figure out how." Sophia said nothing. "I looked into it," Daniel continued. "I shouldn't have maybe, but I did. And the bridge financing came through a subsidiary of a holding company that I eventually traced back to Morgan Capital," Sophia said. Silence. "Yes," Daniel said. She closed her eyes for just a moment. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Sophia, I think it's been going on since the beginning." And there it was. Ethan Walker, the self-made man, the genius of real estate development, the CEO, who was too important for the woman he had married. Ethan Walker had been operating with an invisible safety net his entire career. A safety net woven quietly, carefully, generously by a man he had barely noticed. The man whose daughter he had just handed divorce papers to on their anniversary. Over the next several days, while Ethan was celebrating with champagne and Victoria and congratulating himself on his boldness and his decisiveness and his freedom, Richard Morgan was making phone calls of his own. Not angry phone calls, not threatening phone calls. Richard Morgan didn't threaten. He simply communicated. He had a conversation with the chairman of the bank that held Walker Development's largest credit line, a polite, collegial conversation between 2 men who had known each other for 30 years. He had a lunch with a real estate investor who sat on the board of Ethan's biggest project partner. A friendly lunch, nothing formal, just catching up. He exchanged messages with the head of the contracting firm that supplied Walker Development's biggest development sites. Just a quick note checking in as he often did. Nobody was pressured. Nobody was threatened. Richard Morgan simply stopped using his name on Ethan's behalf. He stopped making the introductions, stopped signaling the quiet assurances that kept nervous investors comfortable, stopped placing the gentle, well-timed endorsements that opened doors. He just stopped. And almost immediately things began to shift. Ethan didn't notice at first. He was busy. He was in love, or whatever he called what he felt for Victoria. He was riding the high of the Horizon Tower, signing planning press releases, scheduling interviews, imagining the skyline with his name on it. Then, 10 days after Sophia signed the papers, his phone rang. It was his project manager on the Hudson Yards expansion. "Ethan, we've got a problem." Ethan was eating lunch with Victoria at a restaurant in the West Village. He stepped outside to take the call, one hand in his pocket, the autumn wind picking up around him. "What kind of problem?" Broderick Partners pulled out. Ethan went still. Broderick Partners was the investment consortium that covered 30% of the Hudson Yards project's equity financing. "What do you mean, pulled out?" "I mean, they sent a letter this morning. They're citing shifting market conditions. They're out." "That's impossible," Ethan said. "I had dinner with Martin Broderick 2 months ago. He was completely committed." "Ethan," his project manager's voice was careful, "I think you need to come in." Ethan went back inside the restaurant, told Victoria something had come up at the office. dropped $300 on the table without looking at the bill, and left. He told himself it was a bump, just a bump. These things happened in real estate. You dealt with them. You pivoted. You found new money. He got back to the office at 2 in the afternoon. By 4, he knew it wasn't just a bump. The bank that held the Hudson Yards construction loan had sent a formal review notice. Not a default notice, not yet, but a review, which in the language of institutional lending was the quiet clearing of a throat before the demand letter. By 6 that evening, 2 more investors had sent withdrawal notices. By 8, when Ethan was still at his desk with his jacket off and his tie loosened, Daniel Brooks knocked on his office door and came in and sat down across from him and said, "Ethan, we need to talk about something." "Not tonight, Daniel." "Ethan." Daniel's voice was steady, firm. He didn't move. "Something is wrong. Not market wrong. Something else." Ethan looked up from his desk. There must have been something in Daniel's face. Something in the way he wasn't moving, wasn't softening his words, wasn't performing the usual corporate reassurance because Ethan sat back slowly. "Say it." "The withdrawals we're seeing," Daniel said. "They're coordinated. The timing is too specific. Broderick, the First National Review. The supplier credit freeze we got this morning, that one I haven't told you about yet because there hasn't been time. These don't happen simultaneously by accident." Ethan stared at him. "Someone," Daniel said carefully, "is pulling strings." The silence in the office lasted a long time. "Who?" Ethan said. Daniel held his gaze. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." Ethan said nothing. He turned to look out the window at the city he had built his life in. The lights of Manhattan glittered in the dark, indifferent and beautiful, and utterly unmoved. He thought about Sophia, not in the way you might expect, not with guilt, not with longing. He thought about her the way you think about a locked door when you're suddenly aware that the key is missing. She had been so calm. That's what kept coming back to him. She had been so completely calm. He picked up his phone. He called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Back in her new apartment, the one she had moved into the week after the signing, a clean-lined space in a brownstone in Brooklyn that she had rented under her own name and arranged herself. Sophia looked at the screen when his name came up. She watched it ring. She let it go. Then she set her phone face down on the table and went back to the architectural drawings she had been working on. She had a meeting in the morning with her own attorney and with a business consultant her father had connected her with. There was a lot of work to do, and the work was honest, and it was hers. And right now, that was the most important thing in the world to her. In Midtown, Ethan sat at his desk in the dark office and didn't know yet what he was looking at. He thought it was a crisis. He didn't understand yet that it was a reckoning. Across the city in the Morgan Capital offices on Park Avenue, Richard Morgan sat in his chair behind his desk after everyone else had gone home, and he looked out over the city his father had built a piece of, and that he had expanded, and that he had protected, and he thought about his daughter in her blue dress sitting on the edge of her bed. He did not feel anger. He felt something older and quieter than anger. He felt the very particular sadness of a parent who has watched someone cause pain to the person they love most, and who now has no further reason to hold anything back. He opened his desk drawer. He took out a small leather notebook. He opened it to a page with a list of names, and he began very slowly to make calls. Not to destroy, not out of rage, simply to stop protecting a man who had stopped deserving it. The city outside his window hummed and blazed and moved as it always did, as it always would. And somewhere across that city, Ethan Walker sat in the dark and felt for the first time in many years the very faint and unfamiliar sensation of the ground moving beneath his feet. He didn't know what it was yet. He would. He would know very soon. But that night he went home to the penthouse, and Victoria was there with takeout and a new dress and a bright, certain smile, and he poured himself a drink and told himself it was a bump. Just a bump. And Victoria laughed at something on television, and the drink was good, and the penthouse was beautiful, and for one more night, Ethan Walker told himself the story of the self-made man. Daniel Brooks did not sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, and 3 years of Walker Development's financial records spread across the screen, and he did what he always did when something didn't add up. He followed the money. Not the surface money, not the money that showed up in the quarterly reports and the press releases and the champagne toasts on the 43rd floor. He followed the money underneath that money, the quiet money, the money that moved without making noise. He had been suspicious for a while, not in a way he could have articulated easily, not in a way that would have survived a boardroom conversation. Just a feeling that had grown steadily over 6 years of watching Walker Development expand at a pace that, if he was being honest with himself, didn't quite match the fundamentals. Real estate development at that level was brutal. Most firms clawed for every deal. Most CEOs spent years building lender relationships from scratch, sweating through due diligence processes, losing deals to competitors with deeper pockets and longer histories. Ethan had never seemed to sweat. Deals came together, financing appeared, partners materialized at exactly the right moment. Daniel had always attributed it to Ethan's charisma, to his aggressive networking, to the particular magic of being in the right place at the right time. But sitting at his kitchen table at 2 a.m, watching the threads connect on his screen, he understood for the first time that the magic had a source. By 3 a.m, he had found the first thread. A 2019 bridge loan that had saved Walker Development's Riverside project from collapse. The loan had come through a Delaware-registered holding company called ArcPoint Ventures. Daniel had looked at ArcPoint 2 years ago when he was auditing the company's historical financing and hit a wall of shell entities that led nowhere. He had moved on. Tonight, with fresh eyes and a new reason to look, he went back. He pulled incorporation records. He cross-referenced registered agents. He traced the ownership structure through 4 layers of entities until he hit a name he recognized: Meridian Capital Partners, a private equity subsidiary of Morgan Capital Group. He sat back in his chair. Then he went further. The original seed capital that had funded Walker Development's first major project in 2011. The land acquisition financing that had seemed to materialize out of nowhere when Ethan was still an unknown developer with one mid-size project to his name. The letter of credit that had convinced the First National Bank to extend Walker Development its first major construction line. All of it traced back through one structure or another to the Morgan family's financial network. Daniel closed his laptop at 4:30 in the morning. He didn't open it again until 6 when he showered, dressed, and drove to the Walker Development offices 2 hours before anyone else arrived. He needed to think before he talked, because what he had found changed everything. Not just about the company, about Ethan. About what was happening right now this week as the deal cancellations and the bank reviews and the supplier credit freezes stacked up on their desks. Daniel had assumed a hostile actor, a competitor, someone Ethan had burned. He had not considered that it might simply be a father. Ethan arrived at 9:15, which was early for him since the Horizon Tower signing. He had that particular tightness around his eyes that Daniel recognized as controlled anxiety, the look Ethan got when things were not going according to the story in his head, and he was working very hard not to let the gap show. "Talk to me," Ethan said as he walked past Daniel's office and gestured for him to follow. Daniel followed. He closed the office door behind him. 3 more investor notices came in overnight, Daniel said. Kelvin Group is requesting an emergency valuation review on the Midtown portfolio. That's in addition to the Broderick withdrawal and the First National review. Ethan stood at his window with his back to Daniel. What's the total exposure? If Kelvin triggers the valuation clause and First National accelerates the construction loan combined with Broderick, we're looking at roughly $40 to $45 million in immediate liquidity need. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "We can bridge it," he said, but his voice didn't have its usual certainty. "Ethan." Daniel paused. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as your CFO, not as someone who works for you." Ethan turned around. "How much do you actually know about how the company got financed going back? All the way back to the beginning?" Something shifted in Ethan's face. "Not much, just enough." "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you know where the money actually came from, the seed capital, the early bridge loans, the introductions that opened the bank relationships." Ethan was very still. "I built this company, Daniel." "I know that's what you believe." The words landed like a slap. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Watch yourself." "I'm trying to help you," Daniel said, and he said it quietly, not backing up, not apologizing. Because I spent last night tracing the financial history of this company, and what I found, Ethan, you need to know this. The infrastructure that this company was built on. The capital, the relationships, the financing structures that made everything possible, they connect back to Morgan Capital, all of them, every major one. The silence in the office was the kind that has weight. Ethan said nothing. Richard Morgan, Daniel said carefully, has been supporting this company since before it was a company. Not directly, never directly. But the network, the access, the credibility, the financing, it came through his connections, his relationships, his capital. Ethan walked to his desk and sat down very slowly, like a man who has just realized the floor beneath him is not as solid as he thought. That's not possible, he said. Ethan. I built this, Ethan said. His voice had a strange quality now, not angry, not yet, but something brittle underneath the surface. I built every deal. I made every call. I sat across from every investor and I sold them on this company. You did, Daniel said. And they bought. But they bought partly because of what they already knew, what they'd already been told, what they'd already been quietly assured about. That part didn't come from you. Ethan stared at the surface of his desk. Daniel let the silence sit. Then Ethan looked up, and his expression had changed again. The brittleness was gone, replaced by something colder. You're saying Richard Morgan is behind what's happening right now. I think he stopped doing what he was doing, Daniel said carefully. I don't think he attacked you. I think he just stopped. That's the same thing. It's really not. And the distinction matters because if he wanted to destroy you, you'd already be destroyed. What's happening right now is slower than that. It's more like the scaffolding is coming down, and we're seeing what the building looks like without it. Ethan stood up abruptly. He walked to the window. He pressed his palm flat against the glass and looked out at the city. Daniel watched him. Call him, Daniel said. Ethan turned around. What? Call Richard Morgan directly. Acknowledge what you know. Ask for a conversation. Ethan looked at him like he had suggested something obscene. I'm not going to beg. I'm not talking about begging, Daniel said. I'm talking about being smart. Whatever you think happened in your marriage, and I'm not here to judge that the business situation is separate. You can separate them. Can I? Ethan said flatly. Can you afford not to? Ethan turned back to the window. His reflection looked back at him from the glass. The expensive suit, the perfect posture, the face of a man who had told himself a very particular story for a very long time. Get out, he said quietly, not angrily, just finished. Daniel nodded. He picked up his folder and walked to the door. With his hand on the handle, he paused. For what it's worth, he said, I think the way you ended your marriage was wrong. I think you knew what Sophia was worth and chose not to value it. And I think whatever happens with the business, that's going to matter to you more in the long run. He opened the door and walked out before Ethan could respond. Ethan stood at the window for a long time after that. He did not call Richard Morgan. Instead, he called Victoria. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and easy and completely unaware of what Daniel had just said in that office. Hey, are we still doing dinner tonight? I saw this place in Tribeca. Not tonight, Ethan said. A brief pause. Is everything okay? Fine, he said. I just have a lot of work. You always have a lot of work, she said, and there was the faintest edge in her voice, something that Ethan registered but filed away. I thought things were supposed to be good now, with the big deal and everything. They are, he said. I'll call you later. He hung up. He sat back down at his desk and opened his laptop and looked at the financial exposure numbers that Daniel had sent him and tried to think. The problem was that for the first time in his adult life, the thinking wasn't coming. The part of his brain that had always produced confident answers, aggressive strategies. The next move, it was quiet, because the framework he had always operated inside the framework of being a self-made man, a builder, a visionary, that framework had developed a crack. And cracks, once you can see them, are very difficult to unsee. Across the city, Sophia was in a conference room with Grace Park and a business strategist named Marcus Webb that her father's office had recommended. Marcus was 50, understated, precise, with the particular quality of someone who had spent decades working in high-stakes financial restructuring and had learned to remove emotion entirely from his assessment of a situation. He laid documents on the table with the calm efficiency of a surgeon. "Your father has asked me to give you a complete picture of the Walker development situation," Marcus said. "Not from a Morgan Capital perspective, from your perspective. So you understand your position." Sophia nodded. "Walker Development currently has 3 major projects in active development," Marcus said. "The Hudson Yards expansion, the Midtown portfolio, and the newly signed Horizon Tower. Combined, those represent approximately $420 million in committed project value." "And the exposure?" Grace asked. "The company's debt structure is highly leveraged, which was manageable as long as the lender and investor relationships remained stable. Those relationships are now destabilizing, not because of market conditions, because the relational infrastructure that supported them is no longer active." Sophia looked at the numbers on the page in front of her. "How long?" she asked. "At current trajectory, 30 days before the first formal default triggers, 60 days before the cascade becomes uncontrollable." Marcus folded his hands on the table. "What your father wants you to understand is this: you are not caught in this collapse. You are entirely separate from it. Your personal finances, your professional reputation, your future, none of it is tied to Walker Development. You signed nothing that created liability. You own nothing that can be claimed. You are free." Sophia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the documents, at the numbers, at the name Walker Development printed at the top of the cover page. "And the company itself?" she asked. "When it collapses, what happens to it?" Marcus and Grace exchanged a brief look. "At some point," Marcus said, "the assets will be liquidated, projects will be sold. The corporate entity will either be restructured under new ownership or dissolved." "Who would buy it?" Another look between them. "That," Grace said carefully, "is actually something we wanted to discuss with you." And there it was, the thing nobody had said yet. Sophia looked at her attorney and then at Marcus, and she understood what they were telling her before they said another word. "My father," she said. "Morgan Capital has the resources to acquire the assets at a significant discount during a distressed sale," Marcus said. "That's simply a financial reality. What happens with those assets after acquisition, who controls them, who leads any successor entity, that's an entirely separate question. And that question has your name on it if you want it." Sophia was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the 12 years. The first week after Daniel's conversation with Ethan moved fast. Too fast. The kind of fast that doesn't feel like speed, it feels like falling. Monday morning, Ethan arrived at the office at 7:30 and found 2 things waiting on his desk. The first was a formal acceleration notice from First National Bank requesting full repayment of the $22 million construction line within 30 days. The second was a resignation letter from his senior project director, a man named Paul Garrett, who had been with Walker Development for 5 years and who had quietly, without drama, accepted a position at a competing firm effective immediately. Ethan read both letters twice. Then he called his personal attorney. "How bad is the First National notice?" he asked. "It's not good," his attorney said. "If they accelerate, it triggers a cross-default clause in the Kelvin Group agreement, which means Kelvin can demand immediate repayment of their equity position as well." "How much all? Combined, you're looking at north of $38 million in the next 30 days. Ethan was quiet. "Ethan," his attorney said, "do you have $38 million liquid?" The answer was no. Walker Development was asset-rich and cash-poor the way most aggressive development firms are. The cash was always moving into sites, into construction, into the next deal. The model worked as long as the financing kept flowing. The moment the financing stopped, the whole structure became a very expensive equation with no solution. "Work on it," Ethan said. "Find a bridge." "I'll try," his attorney said. "But Ethan, the market knows something is wrong. Word travels. If lenders think you're distressed, they won't touch the paper." He hung up and stared at the wall. Paul Garrett's resignation letter was still on his desk. Ethan picked it up and read it again. It was professionally worded, respectful, completely unrevealing. But Ethan knew Paul. Paul didn't do anything without a reason. He had been headhunted before and always said no. He said no because he believed in Walker Development, because he'd told Ethan more than once that he thought the company was on the verge of something historic. People who believe in something don't leave right before the historic moment. They leave when they've seen something that changes their belief. Ethan put the letter down and walked down the hall to where the rest of his senior team had their offices. He stopped at the doorway of the project management suite and looked at the people sitting at their desks. Most of them looked up when they saw him. The ones who looked away quickly were the ones he needed to worry about. He counted 4 who looked away. He went back to his office and closed the door. By Wednesday of that first week, 2 more investors sent formal withdrawal notices. Neither gave a specific reason beyond the standard language about portfolio rebalancing and market uncertainty. Ethan's PR firm called to ask how they should handle the questions coming from the financial press. Apparently, the Wall Street Journal was working on a story about instability at Walker Development. "Tell them no comment," Ethan said. "Ethan, no comment at this stage tends to confirm no comment," he said again and hung up. That evening, Victoria came to the penthouse with dinner from an upscale restaurant, wearing a new dress and carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's car payments. She set everything out on the kitchen counter with the efficient cheerfulness of someone who has decided that the correct response to tension is to pretend it isn't there. "I got your favorite," she said, "the short rib." Ethan sat at the kitchen island and looked at the food and felt nothing. "I'm not hungry," he said. Victoria paused. She set down the container she was holding and looked at him. "Ethan, talk to me. What's going on? You've been completely unreachable for 3 days." "Business stuff," he said. "Business stuff," she repeated. Something in her voice had changed. "You always say that. Can you be a little more specific? Because I'm starting to feel like I'm in a relationship with your voicemail." "Victoria." "No, I'm serious." She crossed her arms. "When you came to me and said your marriage was over and you wanted to be with me, I believed you. I gave up a lot to be with you. And now 3 weeks later, you're sitting there looking at me like I'm a stranger." Ethan looked at her. He saw for the first time something that he should have seen much earlier. Not a woman in love, but a woman doing a calculation. She had left a good job. She had burned a professional bridge. She had structured her life around his life. And she was only just now beginning to understand that the architecture of his life might be less stable than she had been led to believe. "Everything is fine," he said. "Is it yes?" She studied him for a long moment. Then she uncorked the wine and poured herself a glass and sat across from him and said nothing more. But something between them had shifted, something that would not shift back. Thursday brought a new crisis. The general contractor on the Hudson Yards project sent a formal stop work notice citing non-payment of a $3.2 million invoice that was 40 days overdue. Ethan hadn't known about the overdue invoice. His accounts payable team had flagged it apparently 2 weeks ago. Someone had decided to manage it without escalating. That someone had also resigned earlier that week. The stop work notice meant the project was now legally paused, which meant the project was now in breach of its development agreement with the city, which meant the city could move to reclaim the site. Ethan called Daniel. "I need you in my office right now." Daniel arrived in 4 minutes. He was carrying a folder, which told Ethan he had already been expecting this call. "The Hudson Yards stop work," Ethan said. "I know," Daniel said. He sat down without being asked. "I've been on the phone with the contractor's CFO since 7 this morning. They're willing to pause the formal breach clock for 5 business days if we can demonstrate a clear payment plan." 5 days? 5 days. Ethan pressed his hands flat on his desk. "What do we have liquid right now? Right now today?" Daniel opened his folder. "After the operational expenses that are due this week, approximately $4.1 million. That doesn't cover the invoice." "No, and it doesn't cover the payroll cycle that hits next Friday, which is another 2.8. Ethan stood up and walked to the window. It was becoming a habit standing at the window when the numbers got too heavy to sit with. The city outside looked the same as it always did, indifferent, moving, completely uninterested in his problem. "I need you to call every lender relationship we have," Ethan said, "every one, and find out who will give us a bridge." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I've already started," he said, "and 3 have declined outright. 2 are asking for personal guarantees, which you'll need to evaluate. 1 Compass Financial on the West Coast is willing to have a conversation, but they want a full financial disclosure package before any meeting. Set up the meeting. Ethan, Daniel paused. I have to be straight with you. The story in the market right now is not good. Compass will do their own due diligence before they commit to anything. If what they find confirms what's circulating, that this company is structurally over-leveraged and has lost its anchor relationships, they'll walk too. Then we need to give them a better story, Ethan said. Daniel looked at him steadily. The story has to be true, Ethan. At this point, anything that looks like misrepresentation becomes a legal problem on top of a financial problem. Ethan turned from the window. His face was hard. Are you my CFO or my conscience? Right now, Daniel said calmly, I'm both. And you need both. The look that passed between them was long and complicated. Then Ethan sat back down and rubbed his face with both hands and said, Set up the Compass meeting. Daniel nodded and stood up. He was almost at the door when Ethan said without looking up, Do you think she knew Sophia? Do you think she knew what her father had done? What he'd been doing? Daniel turned around slowly. He thought about Sophia calling him the morning after she signed the papers. He thought about the questions she had asked, precise and direct, not the questions of someone who was lost, but the questions of someone who was confirming a map they had already mostly drawn. He thought about the meeting she was probably in right now, the one he suspected had been set up through Morgan Capital, the one that was going to be about next steps and structures and futures. What I think, Daniel said carefully, is that Sophia is a great deal more than you ever gave her credit for. He left, and Ethan sat alone in his office with the truth of that sentence settling over him like weather. The second week was worse. The Wall Street Journal story ran on Tuesday. It was not sensational. It was worse than sensational. It was precise and well-sourced, and it laid out the financial difficulties at Walker Development with the clinical accuracy of a diagnosis. The headline read, Walker Development faces liquidity crisis amid investor exodus. The story mentioned the Broderick withdrawal, the First National acceleration, the Hudson Yards stop work. It quoted 2 anonymous sources close to the company describing internal disarray. It noted that Walker Development had declined to comment. Ethan read the story on his phone at 6 a.m. before he got out of bed. Victoria, who was still at the penthouse, came out of the bathroom and looked at his face and said, How bad? He handed her the phone. She read it. He watched her read it. He watched her face change, not dramatically, not obviously, but in small ways that he had learned over the months to notice. The slight tightening around the eyes, the careful, neutral expression that replaced her usual warmth, the way she handed the phone back without saying anything right away. It'll be fine, he said. Of course, she said. But she was quiet at breakfast, and when he left for the office, she didn't kiss him the way she usually did. She gave him a brief press of lips to the cheek, like punctuation at the end of a sentence she wasn't sure she wanted to finish. At the office, 3 more team members submitted resignations before 10 a.m. The Compass financial meeting, which Daniel had scheduled for Thursday, was postponed by Compass with a brief email citing scheduling conflicts. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Ethan's phone rang constantly. Investors, attorneys, contractors, journalists. He stopped answering calls he didn't recognize. He told his assistant to hold everything that wasn't critical. By midday, his inbox had 412 unread messages. He called his personal attorney again. The Compass postponement, he started. I saw it, his attorney said. Ethan, I need to be direct with you. We are running out of options on the financing side. The market has made a judgment, and right now that judgment is going against you. Then I need to find someone who hasn't made that judgment yet. There are people who will lend in distressed situations, his attorney said, but the terms will be punishing. We're talking double-digit interest rates, heavy collateral requirements, personal guarantees. I'll consider it. Ethan, a pause. Have you considered reaching out to Richard Morgan directly? The line went quiet. No, Ethan said. It might be the only move that... I said no. He hung up. That night, alone in the penthouse, because Victoria had said she needed to stay at her own apartment, Ethan sat with a glass of whiskey and thought about Richard Morgan for the first time as a real person, rather than a footnote. He had met the man perhaps a dozen times over the course of his marriage. Holiday dinners, the occasional family event. Richard had always been cordial, measured, attentive, in the way of someone who is always aware of everything in the room without appearing to be. Ethan had never found him particularly impressive in person. He had always assumed that was because Ethan himself was impressive, and impressive men sometimes flatten their surroundings. He understood now that what he had mistaken for flatness was simply control. Richard Morgan never showed his hand because he never needed to. The whiskey was very good, and it did nothing to improve how he felt. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria Hope. "You're okay. Early day tomorrow. Talk soon." He stared at the message. Talk soon. Not I love you. Not I'm here. Not even I'm thinking of you. Talk soon. He set the phone face down on the cushion beside him and finished his drink. The third week, the cascade that Daniel had predicted became impossible to ignore. The cross-default clause triggered exactly as Daniel had said it would. Kelvin Group formally exercised their right to demand immediate repayment of their equity position, $31 million. Added to the First National acceleration and the outstanding contractor invoices, Walker Development's immediate liability was now approaching $80 million against liquid assets of less than $4 million. It was over. In the technical sense, it had been over for days. But the third week was when it became undeniable. Daniel came to Ethan's office at 11 on a Tuesday morning and sat down across from him and said very quietly, "We need to talk about filing." Ethan looked up from his desk. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his collar was open, and he had the look of a man who had been fighting gravity for 3 weeks and was beginning to understand that gravity always wins. "No," he said. "Ethan, no. Chapter 11 gives us protection while we restructure. It's not the end. Companies come back from, I said no." Ethan's voice cracked on the word. Just slightly. Just enough. He pressed his hands against the desk and breathed. There has to be another way. Daniel looked at him with something that was not quite pity but was close to it. The kind of look that a person who has watched someone fight an unwinnable fight gives them at the moment when the fight becomes clearly lost. Not judgment, just sadness. "There isn't," Daniel said. I've looked everywhere." The silence in the office lasted a long time. Then Ethan said, his voice very low, "Is there anyone buying?" Daniel paused. "What do you mean?" "If the company goes into distress proceedings, is anyone positioned to buy the assets?" Daniel was careful with his next words. "There are always buyers in distressed situations." "Who?" Another careful pause. "There is one entity that has the capital and the existing knowledge of the asset portfolio to move quickly in a distressed acquisition." Ethan looked at him. "Morgan Capital," Daniel said. The word landed in the room like something physical. Ethan pushed back from his desk and stood up. He walked to the window again, that city again, indifferent and glittering and completely unmoved. He stood there for a long time without speaking. "She planned this," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something between an accusation and a realization. "I don't think it was planned," Daniel said carefully. "I think the opportunity exists because the circumstances exist, which is different." "Is it?" "Yes, because Sophia didn't create your financial structure. She didn't make Walker Development dependent on Morgan Capital's support. She didn't make you over-leveraged. She didn't make you sign Victoria's transfer request or blow up your marriage on your anniversary." Daniel stood up. His voice was steady, almost gentle, but it didn't flinch. "You did all of that yourself, Ethan, and I think you know it." Ethan said nothing. He just stood at the window. Daniel picked up his folder. "I'll have the filing documents ready for you to review by end of day. The sooner we move, the more we protect the employees who are still here." He walked to the door. "Daniel." Ethan's voice stopped him. He didn't turn around from the window. "When you talk to Sophia, and I assume you do tell her—" He stopped, started again. "Tell her nothing. Never mind." Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'll have the documents ready," he said, and left. The fourth week was the one that finished it. The bankruptcy filing generated exactly the kind of press coverage that Ethan had spent his entire career trying to avoid. The Journal ran a second story. Bloomberg picked it up. The financial wires put it on their feeds. Walker Development, the company that had been celebrated 18 months ago in a profile that described Ethan as one of the most dynamic developers of his generation, was officially in Chapter 11 proceedings with total liabilities of approximately $94 million against assets valued at significantly less than that in a distressed market. Ethan went to the office on the morning the filing was made public because he didn't know what else to do with himself. He sat at his desk and read the coverage on his laptop. He read his own name in sentences that described failure and collapse and over-leveraged ambition. He read quotes from industry observers he had once considered peers who now spoke about Walker Development in the past tense with the particular smugness of people who had always suspected the success was fragile. He was still sitting there at noon when his assistant, one of 3 staff members who had stayed, knocked on his door and said, "Mr. Walker, there's someone here to see you." He looked up. "I don't have any meetings." "She doesn't have an appointment," his assistant said, "but she says you'll want to see her." Something shifted in his chest. For one completely irrational moment, he hoped it was Sophia. It was Victoria. She came into his office looking like someone who had practiced what they were going to say and then forgotten half of it at the door. She was dressed professionally, more professionally than she'd been dressing lately, and she was carrying her handbag in a way that told him she wasn't planning to stay long. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She put her bag on her lap. She looked at him across the desk that had once represented power and significance and had now become a piece of furniture in a bankrupt company. "I've accepted a position," she said, "at Meridian Group. I start in 2 weeks." He looked at her. "Meridian Group." "Yes. That's a Morgan Capital subsidiary." A flicker of something crossed her face. "It's a good position. Senior executive assistant to the managing director." Ethan sat back in his chair. He looked at the woman he had blown up his marriage for. He looked at her with new eyes, not angry eyes, not betrayed eyes, but the eyes of someone who is finally seeing a picture clearly after spending months looking at it from the wrong angle. "Did they approach you?" he asked. "What? Meridian. Did they approach you, or did you go to them?" She hesitated, just a fraction of a second, just enough. "They approached me," she said. He nodded slowly. She stood up. She smoothed her jacket. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has decided that the kindest thing they can do is end the conversation before it becomes honest. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said. "I really am." She left. He sat there alone in the office where Walker Development had lived and breathed and expanded and then contracted and then failed completely, and he thought about that fraction of a second hesitation. He thought about what it meant that a Morgan Capital subsidiary had reached out to his secretary. He thought about what it meant that she had said yes. He thought about what it meant that she was leaving now today, the day the bankruptcy filing was public. He thought about Sophia signing those papers with that perfectly steady hand. He picked up his phone. He opened his contacts. He looked at Sophia's name for a long time. He put the phone down without calling. Because what would he say? What could he possibly say? "Sorry, I handed you divorce papers on our anniversary. Sorry, I was too arrogant to see what was holding me up. Sorry, I didn't understand the value of the person standing next to me until she was gone, and everything she represented was gone with her." He sat at his desk as the afternoon light changed around him, and the city outside kept moving with absolute indifference, and for the first time in his adult life, Ethan Walker had nothing to plan and no story to tell himself and nowhere to put his hands. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He had stopped answering unknown numbers 2 weeks ago, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Walker?" The voice was male, professional, unhurried. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent a private acquisition group that has an interest in the Walker Development asset portfolio. We'd like to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience." Ethan straightened in his chair. "What kind of interest?" "A purchasing interest," Marcus said. "The group I represent is prepared to move quickly. Full acquisition, clean exit for you and your creditors." "Who is the group?" A brief pause. I'm not at liberty to disclose that before the initial meeting. Standard procedure in distressed acquisitions. Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment. He knew. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the humiliation and the 4 weeks of sustained collapse, he knew. When? He said. Tomorrow morning, Marcus said. If that works? It works, Ethan said. He hung up. He sat in the silence of his failing office. He thought about what tomorrow would look like, what he would walk into, who would be on the other side of the table, what it would mean to sit across from the proof of everything he had refused to understand. He thought about 12 years, about a blue dress, about candles being knocked over by a leather folder thrown across a table. He sat there as the light changed and the city moved, and the clock on his office wall counted out the final hours of Walker development, and he didn't move. He didn't call anyone. He didn't pour a drink. He just sat there, because there was nowhere left to go. And the worst part, the part that he could not say to anyone, that he could not admit to Daniel or his attorney or the empty penthouse, was that somewhere underneath the wreckage, underneath the pride and the shame and the anger, there was something that felt almost like relief, like a man who has been holding his breath for 12 years, finally at the very end exhaling. Ethan did not sleep that night. He lay in the penthouse that suddenly felt too large and too quiet, staring at the ceiling, running the same loop over and over in his mind. Marcus Webb, the acquisition meeting, the name he hadn't been given but already knew. He thought about calling Daniel to talk through strategy, to rehearse what he would say, to find some angle that would give him back a fraction of the control he had spent 4 weeks watching drain away. But every time he reached for his phone, he put it down again. Because strategy implied there was still a game being played, and somewhere between Victoria walking out of his office and that unknown number calling Ethan had begun to understand that the game had already ended. He arrived at the address Marcus Webb had texted him at 8:45 the next morning. It was a building in Midtown. He knew well he had been in these conference rooms before, years ago, for meetings that had gone well. The kind of building that radiated quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, because everyone who mattered already knew what happened inside it. The receptionist showed him to a conference room on the 31st floor without ceremony. There was water on the table. There was a legal pad in front of each chair. There was a view of the city that Ethan had once loved and now found impossible to look at without feeling the particular nausea of a man being reminded of everything he had lost. He sat down. He waited. Marcus Webb came in first, exactly on time, and shook Ethan's hand with the professional neutrality of someone who is paid to have no opinion about the human beings on either side of a transaction. He sat down. He opened a folder. He said, "Thank you for coming, Mr. Walker. The principals will be with you in a moment." Principals. Plural. Ethan straightened his jacket. The door opened. Daniel Brooks walked in first. Ethan felt a flash of genuine surprise. He had not known Daniel would be here, had not known Daniel had taken a position on the other side of this. Something crossed his face, some brief involuntary flicker of hurt, and Daniel met his eyes steadily and gave him a small, honest nod that said, "I'm sorry, and I'm not sorry, and you know why." Then Sophia walked in. Ethan had told himself during the long, sleepless hours of the previous night that he was prepared for this. He had constructed a mental image of how this moment would go, controlled professional, the kind of meeting where everyone behaves as though the personal history in the room is irrelevant to the business at hand. He had told himself he would not react, that he would be the version of himself that had once commanded rooms and closed deals and made people believe. He was not prepared. Not for Sophia in a charcoal blazer with her hair pulled back and her posture completely relaxed, carrying nothing but a single leather portfolio that she set on the table in front of her with the ease of someone who belongs in a room. Not for the way she looked at him directly, without hostility, without warmth, with the clear and settled expression of someone who has already resolved every feeling they needed to resolve and is now simply here to conduct business. She sat down across from him. "Ethan," she said. Just his name, even and clear. "Sophia," he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. Marcus opened the meeting with the formal language of acquisition proceedings, asset schedules, liability assessments, the structure of the proposed purchase. Ethan listened with half his mind, while the other half was occupied with the woman sitting across from him, trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the person he thought he had known for 12 years, and failing because they were not the same person. Or rather, they were the same person, and the person he had thought he knew had always been a version he had constructed, because the real one was too complicated and too capable for the story he was telling about himself. When Marcus finished the overview, Sophia opened her portfolio and slid a single document across the table to Ethan. "This is the acquisition offer," she said. "It covers all active projects, the corporate entity, and the associated intellectual property, including the Walker Development brand and trademarks." Ethan looked at the number on the document. It was fair, genuinely fair, not the punishing lowball figure he had anticipated. He had expected to be squeezed. He had expected the number to be designed to humiliate. It wasn't. It was a real number, the kind a real buyer would offer for real assets in a distressed situation. That somehow made it worse. "The brand," he said. His voice was controlled. "You want the Walker Development brand." "The acquisition includes it," Sophia said. "Standard in a full corporate purchase." "What are you going to do with it?" She looked at him evenly. "Retire it." The word hit him in the chest. Retire it. Not repurpose, not rebrand, not continue under different management. Retire it, which meant erase it, which meant the name he had put on buildings, the name that had been in the Journal and on the Bloomberg Wire and in the mouths of every real estate professional on the East Coast. That name would simply cease to exist. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "You could keep it running, with new leadership." "I know I could," she said. "I'm choosing not to." The room was very still. Daniel was looking at the table. Marcus was looking at his folder. Ethan was looking at Sophia. Sophia was looking at Ethan. "Why?" he said. It came out less composed than he intended, less like a businessman asking a strategic question, and more like a man asking the actual question underneath it. Sophia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful but not unkind. "Because what I'm building doesn't need the foundation of what you built. It needs its own foundation. And I think," she paused just slightly, "I think you understand why I can't carry your name forward, even professionally." Ethan looked at her for a long time. Then he looked down at the document in his hands. He had signed a lot of documents in his life. Contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, loan agreements, partnership agreements, the divorce papers which he had prepared himself and delivered to a dinner table on an anniversary. He had signed all of them with the confidence of a man who believed he was building something permanent. This document was different. This document was the signature that ended the thing he had spent his entire adult life constructing. "I need a few minutes," he said. "Of course," Marcus said. Sophia and Daniel and Marcus stepped out. The door closed behind them with a quiet, definitive click. Ethan sat alone in the conference room. He looked at the document. He looked at the city outside the window. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had signed so many things, that had shaken so many hands, that had poured champagne and typed on keyboards and gripped the wheel of cars that no longer existed in his garage because the bank had taken them back. He thought about the moment he had thrown the divorce folder onto the table. He had done it with such certainty, such complete and absolute certainty that he was the one making the powerful move, that he was the one controlling the situation, that Sophia would react in the way that people who have less power react when the person with more power makes a decision. He had been wrong about every single part of that. He thought about what Daniel had said weeks ago, sitting across from him in his office. "Sophia is a great deal more than you ever gave her credit for." He had been angry when Daniel said it. He had told himself it was disloyal, unprofessional, inappropriate. But sitting here now in this conference room about to sign his company into the hands of the woman he had dismissed, Ethan understood that Daniel had been doing him a kindness. The kind of kindness that tells you the truth when the truth can still theoretically do some good. He picked up the pen. He signed. Every page, every initial. The same document he had handed her on their anniversary, now reversed, not dissolving a marriage, but dissolving what the marriage had partly built and handing it to the person he had hurt in the building of it. He set the pen down. He pressed the intercom button on the conference room table. "I'm ready," he said. They came back in. Marcus collected the signed documents with professional efficiency. Daniel was quiet. Sophia sat down across from Ethan again, and she looked at the signed document for a moment, and something very brief and very human moved across her face. Not triumph, nothing like triumph. Something more like the specific sadness of a person who wanted a different outcome to a story and is now watching the actual ending arrive. "Sophia," Ethan said. She looked at him. He had rehearsed things to say. He had run through versions of this in his head the night before, explanations, defenses, things that would frame his behavior in a more understandable light, things that would acknowledge some error without conceding everything. All of it felt false now. All of it felt like more storytelling, more of the same machinery that had gotten him here. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. No explanation, no framework, no but following it. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. "I know you are," she said quietly. "I think you've been sorry for a while. I think you started being sorry before you called me from the conference room that night, and I didn't pick up." She paused. "But being sorry doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't change what you showed me about who you were when things were good and you thought you didn't need me." Ethan said nothing. "What I want you to understand," she continued, and her voice was very steady, not hard, not warm, just honest, "is that my father didn't do this to you, and I didn't do this to you. What happened to Walker Development happened because the company was built on a structure that depended on support you didn't acknowledge and didn't value. When that support ended, the structure failed. That's not revenge, that's just architecture." The word landed. Architecture, her word. Her profession, the thing she had spent 12 years doing while he was building his empire and dismissing her designs as small and community-focused and insufficiently ambitious. "I understand that now," he said, and he meant it. That was perhaps the most painful part, that he meant it completely. Sophia nodded once. She gathered her portfolio. She stood up. Ethan stood too reflexively, the old habit of courtesy asserting itself. They stood across the table from each other, two people who had shared a bed and a last name, and 12 years of a life now on opposite sides of a conference table in Midtown with a signed acquisition document between them. "What happens now?" he asked. "For you." She looked at him with an expression that was close to kindness. "I build something," she said, "the right way." Then she extended her hand. He looked at it for just a moment. Then he shook it. Her grip was firm and brief. Then she turned and walked toward the door, and Daniel fell into step beside her, and Marcus gathered his folders, and the room emptied around Ethan until he was alone again. He stood there for a moment. Then he straightened his jacket the way he always did, the automatic gesture of a man who maintains his posture, even when there's no one left to see it, and he walked out. He took the elevator down to the lobby. He walked through the revolving door into the cold Midtown air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the city moving around him in every direction, completely indifferent to the man standing still in the middle of it. He had no car. The cars were gone. He had no driver scheduled because he had let the car service account lapse 2 weeks ago when the credit line dried up. He had no meetings because there was no company to have meetings for. He had a penthouse that was under a lease he was going to have to renegotiate at a fraction of the current terms. He had his phone. He had the suit on his back. He had approximately $43,000 in his personal account, which sounded like money until you calculated how fast it disappeared in New York. He started walking. He didn't have a destination. He just walked. He walked through Midtown with his hands in his pockets and his breath visible in the cold air, and the city moved around him the way it always had, the way it would long after he had ceased to be a figure of any significance in it. At some point his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His mother calling from Connecticut. He answered. "I saw the news," she said. Her voice was careful. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said, automatic. A pause. "Ethan?" "I'm not fine," he said. "But I will be." Another pause. What happened with Sophia? The real story. He kept walking. Around him, New York did what New York always does, moved and blared and breathed completely unmoved. "I made a mistake," he said. "A big one. With Sophia. With everything," he said. "With Sophia, with the company, with the story I was telling myself about who I was. All of it." His mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the particular gentleness of a parent who has been waiting a long time for their child to arrive at something, "Come home for a few days." He thought about it. The penthouse, the empty garage, Victoria's talk, soon text that had been followed by silence, the conference room where he had just signed his name to the end of everything he had built. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He hung up and kept walking. 3 blocks later, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that turned out to be a journalist from the Journal asking for comment on the acquisition. He typed, "No comment," and put his phone back in his pocket. 2 blocks after that, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from a number he recognized, a man named Greg Hawthorne, who ran a mid-size real estate firm in New Jersey, someone Ethan had known slightly for years, never paid much attention to because the firm was too small to be interesting. The text read, "Heard what happened. I know the timing is rough, but if you ever want to talk about a fresh start, I mean it. No strings, just coffee." Ethan read it twice. He almost deleted it. The old Ethan would have deleted it too small, too beneath him. Not the right level, not the right story. He typed back, "I'll take you up on that." This week, Greg responded in 30 seconds, "Thursday works. My office in Newark. Noon." Ethan put his phone in his pocket. He kept walking. He passed a construction site, scaffolding and concrete and workers in hard hats, moving with the particular, purposeful efficiency of people who are building something from the ground up. He stopped for just a moment and watched, just watched. The work of it, the rawness, the absence of glass towers and acquisition documents and invisible financial scaffolding. Just people building something real. He had forgotten what that looked like. He had forgotten somewhere in the years of champagne and midtown offices and self-made man mythology what it actually looked like to build something. Not to manage it, not to leverage it, not to use it as evidence of a story about yourself. Just to build it. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended. Then he started walking again. That evening, alone in the penthouse, for what he had already decided would be one of the last times he sat at the kitchen island with a glass of water. No whiskey. He had decided he was done using whiskey to manage reality. And he thought about what Sophia had said. That's not revenge. That's just architecture. He thought about the word architecture. He thought about the way she had used it, the precision of it, the fact that she had chosen her own language to explain what had happened. Not the language of betrayal or justice or revenge, the language of structure, of foundation, of what holds things up and what happens when it's removed. She had been an architect the entire time, not just of buildings, of her own life, and he had spent 12 years standing next to an architect and thinking she was just decorating. His phone buzzed one more time that evening. He looked at the screen, expecting another journalist or another creditor or another reminder of what no longer existed. It was Daniel. The text said simply, "For what it's worth, I think you handled today with more dignity than I expected. That matters. Take care of yourself, Ethan." Ethan stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back, "Thank you for telling me the truth when it mattered. I didn't listen. I should have." He set the phone down. He sat in the quiet of the penthouse as the city lights came on outside the window, doing what they always did, indifferent and beautiful and completely unconcerned with the man sitting inside watching them. And Ethan Walker, who had started this month as the CEO of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who had celebrated a landmark deal, who had believed himself to be the author of his own extraordinary success, sat in the wreckage of the story he had told himself, and tried to figure out what an honest version of that story might look like. Not the self-made man, not the visionary, not the one who had outgrown his wife, just a man who had been wrong, who had been supported and hadn't known it, who had been loved and hadn't valued it, who had looked at the person next to him and seen a limitation when he should have seen a foundation. Just a man, sitting in the dark, with a Thursday coffee meeting in Newark, and for the first time in a very long time, maybe the first time in 12 years, no story on top of that. Just the fact of it. Just the truth of where he was and how he had gotten here and what, if anything, might be built from what remained. Outside the window, New York kept moving. It always did. The Thursday coffee in Newark happened exactly as Greg Hawthorne had said it would. No strings, no performance, just two men at a table in a small office above a parking garage in a part of the city that had nothing to do with the Manhattan skyline or the 43rd floor or any of the architecture of the life Ethan had just lost. Greg was 51, heavyset with the easy manner of someone who had never needed to impress anyone because he had long ago made peace with exactly who he was. He poured coffee from a machine on the credenza and handed Ethan a mug and sat down across from him without preamble. "So," Greg said, "you blew it up." Ethan looked at him. "Yeah. Professionally and personally. Yeah." Greg nodded slowly, like a man receiving information he had already suspected. "How are you sleeping?" "I'm not." "That'll change," Greg said. "Takes about 6 weeks for the noise to settle. Then you start sleeping again." He picked up his own mug. "I went through something similar in 2009. Lost a company. Not as big as yours, but big enough. Felt like the end of the world for about 4 months. Ethan looked at him. He hadn't known that about Greg. In the years when Walker Development was expanding and Greg's firm was doing modest work in the outer boroughs, Ethan had filed Greg Hawthorne in the category of people who were fine at what they did, but simply hadn't reached the level that Ethan was operating at. He understood now that the category had been about Ethan's ego, rather than Greg's actual life. "What did you do?" Ethan asked. "Went back to basics," Greg said simply. "Stopped trying to run a company and started trying to do good work. Stopped thinking about the story and started thinking about the building." He paused. "Real estate is real, Ethan. The money and the meetings and the press, that's all overlay. Underneath it is actual land and actual structures and actual people who need actual places to live and work. I'd forgotten that. Losing everything reminded me." Ethan was quiet. "I'm not offering you a grand position," Greg said. "I want to be clear about that. I have a project director role open. It pays well, but not extravagantly. You'd be doing real work. On the ground. Not managing people who manage projects. Actual decisions on actual sites." Ethan looked at him. A month ago, even 2 weeks ago, he would have found this conversation insulting. Project director at a mid-size firm in New Jersey, a role he had been 20 years past for 20 years. "Why me?" he asked. Greg looked at him straight. "Because underneath all the noise, you know how to read a deal. You know how to see a site. That didn't go away just because everything else did. And I'd rather have someone who learned something the hard way than someone who's never been tested." Ethan nodded slowly. He took the job. He started the following Monday. The first week was humbling in ways he hadn't fully anticipated, even having anticipated humility. He sat in project meetings where he was not the most senior person in the room. He reviewed documents that required his input rather than his approval. He drove to sites in New Jersey in a 3-year-old Accord that he had bought with cash because he no longer had the credit profile for a lease on anything impressive. He ate lunch at his desk most days, which was a normal desk in a normal office with no window and no view of the Manhattan skyline. He did not hate it. That was the thing that surprised him most. He had expected to hate it, to feel the constant burn of diminishment, to spend every hour measuring the distance between where he was and where he had been. Instead, he found something he hadn't expected to find. He found the work itself, the actual texture of it, the problems that needed solving, and the thinking required to solve them, and the specific satisfaction of a decision that turned out to be right. He called his mother on Friday of that first week. "How was it?" she asked. "Honest," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a good word." Meanwhile, across the river, Sophia Morgan was doing something that would take 2 years to fully understand, but that began in the weeks immediately following the acquisition of Walker Development's assets. She had not moved to a different city. She had not retreated to her father's world or wrapped herself in the Morgan capital infrastructure the way she could have. She had taken the acquired assets, the project contracts, the development rights, the real estate positions, and used them as the foundation for something structurally different from anything Walker Development had ever been. She called it Foundation Design Group. The name was deliberate. Foundation. Not tower, not development, not capital. Foundation. Because what she was building was meant to support something, not merely to impress. Daniel Brooks came with her. He had submitted his resignation from Walker Development's bankruptcy estate the day after the acquisition meeting, effective immediately, and had called Sophia that same evening. "I'd like to discuss a CFO position," he said. "I know," she said. "I was going to call you tomorrow." He laughed a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from relief. "How did you know?" "Because you're the only person in that building who told Ethan the truth when it mattered," she said. "That's the kind of person I need." He started 2 weeks later. Foundation Design Group's first project was not a tower. It was not a midtown development or a luxury residential portfolio or any of the asset classes that Walker Development had chased, because they were the ones that generated the biggest headlines. It was a mixed-use community development project in the South Bronx, affordable housing, combined with ground-floor commercial space designed specifically for small local businesses, built around a central shared courtyard that Sophia had designed herself. It was by the standards of the world Ethan had inhabited a small project. The budget was $38 million. It would generate modest returns. It would not make the front page of the Wall Street Journal's business section. It made the front page of the architecture section 6 months after groundbreaking in a piece that described Sophia Morgan as one of the most original design minds working in urban development in America. The article noted that Foundation Design Group had somehow managed to create a development that served the community it was built in, rather than simply occupying the land it sat on. It quoted architects and urban planners and city officials who had worked with the project. It quoted residents who had been involved in the design process. It did not quote Sophia extensively. She had given the journalist a single comment: "The best buildings are the ones that people don't want to leave. That's all we're trying to build." Her phone rang constantly for 2 weeks after that piece ran. Not investors looking for returns, architects, city planners, nonprofit housing organizations, community development funds, people who had been trying to do something real in real estate and had found the industry's incentive structures consistently pointed the other way. Sophia took every call. She said yes to the ones that fit what Foundation Design Group was actually trying to do, and said a respectful no to the ones that didn't. And she made those distinctions clearly and without apology, because she had always known really, but had perhaps not exercised fully that clarity about what you are is not arrogance. It's integrity. Richard Morgan watched all of this from a careful distance. He had lunch with Sophia once a month, always at a restaurant she chose, always a real conversation rather than a business meeting, and he was scrupulous about the line between supporting his daughter and interfering with her work. Morgan Capital had no financial position in Foundation Design Group. Richard had offered twice in his careful and non-pressuring way, and Sophia had declined both times. "I need it to be mine," she said the second time he offered. "Completely mine. Not because I don't trust you, because I need to know." Richard had looked at her across the restaurant table with the expression of a man who is genuinely proud and genuinely at peace. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to make the offer." She reached across and covered his hand with hers for a moment. "I know you did." That was enough. 18 months after Foundation Design Group's founding, the firm had 4 active projects in 3 cities, a team of 22 people, and a growing reputation in the architecture and urban development world that had nothing to do with the Morgan name and everything to do with the quality and integrity of the work. Sophia was invited to speak at the Urban Land Institute conference in Chicago. She was profiled in Architectural Digest. She was asked to join the board of a national affordable housing advocacy organization, which she accepted. She was building, really building, the way she had always wanted to. And then came the moment that nobody had exactly planned, but that everyone who knew the story recognized as inevitable. It was a Thursday afternoon in March, 22 months after Sophia had signed the divorce papers on the night of her anniversary, and she was on a construction site in Brooklyn, a Foundation Design Group project, a community arts center, combined with affordable studio apartments for working artists, walking the site with her project manager and 2 members of the design team. She heard his voice before she saw him, not speaking to her, speaking to someone else on the other side of a concrete partition. The professional cadence of a man reviewing a construction schedule. She recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something that has been part of the texture of your daily life for years, and then disappeared, not dramatically, just suddenly absent. She came around the partition. Ethan was standing with 2 men she didn't recognize, holding a set of rolled plans and pointing at something on the structural framing of the adjacent building. He was in a hard hat and a jacket that was clearly not the kind of jacket he used to wear. He looked different. not worse different. Something around the edges of him that had always been tight and controlled had loosened slightly the way a person loosens when they stop performing and start existing. He looked up. Their eyes met. The two men he was with fell away from Sophia's awareness entirely. The noise of the construction site, the machinery and the voices and the percussion of a building being built, all of it fell away. They looked at each other for a moment that was completely ordinary from the outside and enormous from the inside. Then Ethan said, "Sophia." "Ethan," she said. He glanced at the building they were both standing beside. Foundation Design Group's site sign was visible 30 feet away. "This is yours," he said. "Yes." He looked at it for a moment. Something moved across his face, genuine recognition, the look of someone who sees a thing for what it is without the distorting lens of ego or competition. "It's good," he said. "The design, it's really good." She looked at him. She had not expected this, not the sincerity of it, not the simplicity. She had imagined this meeting many times in the 18 months since the conference room, and in the versions she had imagined Ethan was either hostile or broken, or performing some version of composed professionalism. She had not imagined him standing on a construction site in a hard hat, telling her the design was really good, and meaning it with his whole face. "Thank you," she said. A brief silence. "How are you?" she asked, because she was a person who asked real questions. He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than answering automatically. "Better than I was," he said, "working at Hawthorne Development. Project director, New Jersey mostly." She nodded. "It's different from what I was doing," he said. "Smaller, more real, I think, more—" He paused, looking for the word. "Honest." Sophia looked at him. She thought about the man who had thrown the divorce folder onto the table. She thought about the man who had been standing at that conference room window when she walked in. She thought about the signatures and the conversations and the long, painful arc of the previous 2 years. And she thought about this man standing in front of her now using the word honest about his own work and meaning it. "Good," she said simply. His project manager appeared beside him with a question about the schedule. He turned to answer it, and Sophia's project manager materialized beside her with something that needed her decision, and they both moved back into the current of their separate work. The conversation closing naturally, the way real conversations between real people close, not dramatically, not with a speech, just with the world reasserting its demands. But as Sophia walked back to her team, she found that something she had been carrying, some low-level tension she had grown so accustomed to that she'd stopped noticing it had shifted. Lightened. Like setting down a bag you've been holding for so long, it stopped feeling like a burden and just became part of how you moved through the world. She didn't feel triumph. She had never wanted triumph. She wanted exactly what she had: her work, her name, her integrity, her life built on a foundation that she had laid herself. She had all of it. That evening she called her father from her Brooklyn apartment, the one she had chosen herself, decorated herself, filled with the things she actually loved rather than the things that were appropriate for the wife of a man like Ethan Walker. "Dad." "How was the site today?" Richard asked. "Good," she said. "I ran into Ethan." A pause. "And—" she thought about it, about the hard hat and the rolled plans and the word honest. "He seems like he's finding his way," she said. Richard was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and she meant it completely in the way she had not been able to mean it for a long time. "I'm really all right." She could hear her father breathe on the other end of the line. "Good," he said. Just that. The same simplicity she had gotten from him from the beginning of all of this. The calls she didn't need to explain, the support that didn't require performance. The love that had never made demands of her beyond being honestly herself. "I'm coming for dinner Sunday," she said. "I'll bring that wine you like." "I'll make the pasta," he said. She hung up and stood at the window of her apartment, her window, her view, hers, and looked at the city. Not the midtown skyline, not the towers and the glass and the performing ambition of it. Just Brooklyn, alive and complicated and real, the streets moving with the ordinary traffic of people living their lives. She thought about the woman who had sat on the edge of a bed in a blue dress 2 years ago, with candles blown out behind her, and a signed folder on the table, and no certain idea of what came next. She thought about the woman she was now. They were the same woman. That was the important thing. The woman on the bed had not been weak, had not been lost, had not needed to become someone different in order to survive. She had only needed to stop being smaller than she was, to stop fitting herself into the shape of someone else's story. Foundation Design Group had 3 new project proposals on her desk: a community health center in Detroit, a workforce housing development in Atlanta, a school expansion in East Harlem, all of them the kind of work that the real estate industry routinely dismissed as low margin, low profile, not the kind of thing that made careers. All of them the kind of work that Sophia Morgan had always known mattered. She went to her desk, she opened her laptop, she began to review the first proposal. The charity gala happened on a Friday evening in April, 7 weeks after the construction site encounter. The Morgan Family Foundation's annual benefit, the one that Richard had organized for 2 decades to support urban housing and education initiatives across the country. Sophia had always attended. This year, for the first time, Foundation Design Group was one of the featured partners with a presentation on the South Bronx project and its outcomes. She stood at the edge of the room before the program began and looked at the people filling the space: architects and developers and city officials and philanthropists and artists. The kind of room that represented everything she had once attended as Ethan Walker's wife, smiling in appropriate dresses, listening to men discuss visions that she understood better than they did. She was not someone's wife tonight. She was a founder, a designer, a woman who had spent 2 years building something real from the ruins of a life that had been too small for her. Daniel Brooks found her first. He was with his own wife, a warm and straightforward woman named Kay, who had always liked Sophia and who hugged her now with genuine warmth. "The South Bronx presentation tonight," Daniel said. "It's extraordinary, Sophia. The numbers, the design outcomes, the community feedback. I've been doing finance for 20 years, and I've never seen a project with metrics like these. We had a good team," Sophia said. "You had a vision," he said. "Don't give that away." She smiled. "Fair point." Richard found her 20 minutes later moving through the room with the quiet authority of a man who has never needed to announce himself. He kissed her cheek and held her by the shoulders for a moment and looked at her, really looked at her the way he had looked at her since she was a child, with that complete and unhurried attention. "You look like yourself," he said. She laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from the chest. "Is that a compliment?" "It's the best one I have," he said. When the program began and Sophia stood at the podium to present Foundation Design Group's work, she looked out at the room at Daniel and Kay, at her team members scattered through the audience, at her father in the front row, watching her with that quiet, steady expression, at the faces of people she didn't know who were about to hear something she had built. And she felt fully and completely something she had not felt in a long time. She felt like herself. Not Ethan Walker's wife, not Richard Morgan's daughter, not the woman from the divorce papers or the conference room or the blue dress. Herself. Sophia Morgan. Architect. Founder. The woman who had been underestimated by the person who should have known her best and who had taken that underestimation and built something with it that could stand on its own and hold weight and shelter people who needed sheltering. She began to speak, and the room listened. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days after Ethan Walker threw a leather folder onto a dinner table and changed the course of both their lives, Sophia Morgan stood in a room full of people who had come to hear what she had to say, and she said it clearly, and it was true, and it was hers. That is what the ending of a wrong chapter looks like when you refuse to let it be the ending of your story. Not revenge, not triumph, not the satisfaction of watching someone else fall. Just a woman standing in her own light, speaking her own truth, having built her own ground to stand on, and finding, to no one's surprise, but perhaps her own, that the ground was solid, that it held, that it had been there all along, waiting for her to trust it enough to build on it. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be given the life they deserve. Sophia Morgan built hers, and that made every difference.